So yeah, I'm just gonna message on the WhatsApp group also for everybody to return. But in the meanwhile, Niharika, Shobna, if you have questions and want to start off,
Mhm.
if you have any questions for Anuja, we can start.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah.
I want to go first.
Yes, please.
Okay. My issue is that, I mean, archiving follows a process.
Mm.
I've been trying to get into it, but the subject matter of mine, for example, is women who love women or women who love trans masculine persons.
Mm.
Now, to get a background on them, I mean, look at objects people are finding it difficult to give me objects. So in the previous internal discussion, we thought that we'll get it through the oral stories, and then I'll have to go back and look at it. I'll have to go and find it or an image of it or something like that. So I mean, and you mentioned in a performance now as well. So as which is interesting because as part of Queer Inc., I've been able to produce theatre very little. I think we got Bikram Fukan in common. I think I've done work with him. And with publishing and with documentary. So I'm still collecting stories, but it baffles me, invisible women, how to, capture, or the sort of legitimacy question comes in. That's what I'm trying to get to is it, I know, do I make it legitimate, their stories, or it's a philosophical question. My thing is that once it sits in my head, then the rest of the project will be fine. I'll be able to do it ASAP, but it's just that those little things are niggling. And with you've used one image to, for example, in your I forget the name of the performance piece you have.
Lady Anandi.
Lady Anandi, yeah, that one. You've used one image to actually, cover gender, right? Yeah. And the story that goes with it, that's very important. So it's just basically a philosophical question that need not be answered now. I'm just putting it out there, that's all, because once that, I mean, I probably will have more conversations with Ishita as well, but once it sort of sits in my head, then I'll be able to figure the rest of it out.
So Shobna, is the philosophical or the conceptual or even the moral dilemma not finding the stories, or once the story is found, then how do you frame it? Is that what is the
okay, I don't have a moral dilemma on it. I feel that the stories need to be told,
right?
And the stories will be told. I have several people's stories. My thing is, because this is a very invisible population, we don't like to, and India doesn't like women's sexuality at all.
Absolutely.
So how do I make it in the sense that it is believed, is legitimate? And the more I think about it, the more onus feed rests on me, and that is what I think I'm trying to grapple with, is my sense of how do I present it in a manner that will be taken seriously, because the target population I'm looking at is academia, students, general public, definitely not straight men, but the straight men will be there.
So Shobna, I mean, your question of the target is a really critical question, like who is this for? But I also want to ask take a step back and ask you another question. Whose legitimacy are you looking for? I mean, what is this notion of, okay, so like the internet is a great site with its problems, but to make invisible bodies visible. Like, I think when you say these bodies or these stories are invisible, that's already an archival curatorial entry point. If we are talking about something that doesn't exist and we want to put those narratives back, in my experience, people take time to gain legitimacy, to gain credibility, right? Even in the stories you're trying to tell. But I'm of the opinion that it's counterproductive to aspire for that legitimacy, because if these bodies are invisible in the first place, it's a much longer battle. I think the beginning point is just collecting it and claiming it and telling the stories over and over and over again till they gain legitimacy from whoever we want it to come from. I
guess my thing is that we've been so trained to think as academia being
Yes.
legitimate. Yes.
Yeah.
So I want to legitimize the lived experiences, but I don't necessarily want it to go the academia way.
That's right. But the minute a queer person or a trans person comes and claims space or writes a story or stands on stage or even in a forum like this, tells their story, it's an act of legitimacy. What I'm saying is the archive in its utterance is legitimate, not the archive in its reception, right? Because when you are doing work that is so political and so it's questioning so many received notions, in the utterance is an act of acceptance already. Is my way of understanding it. I understand the academia is closed. You need to change the language. I know practically the manifestation is very different. I understand that.
Yeah. Okay, I think this will lead into your next question, which is
what is the next question? Is there a question?
The exercise. How do I want to remember it? Okay.
And like you said, Shobna, this is a much longer question. It's not a question to be answered now. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, just to close or add to that, it also sometimes feels like the question will get answered by the archive that you make or the project that you make. It's that big a question. When I think about Shobna's project, it feels like the act of archiving itself will perhaps give the answer.
That's what I'm saying. The act of utterance.
In the question of resolving before making the archive.
Yes, absolutely. In the utterance is the
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else has question or a thought to discuss with Tanuja before we move on to the exercise?
Yeah, we have.
Could I ask a question and
yes,
comment?
Please. Yeah.
So my comment is, I was really fascinated by the whole inclusion of performance as well. In a sense, it's also a metaphor for the archive, because people think of the archive as something very tangible, but it's also ephemeral in a sense, and the body and performance itself changes. It depends how it's viewed. My question also, since I also work with history and memory, is I know someone said ask whether it's a therapy session, but also as bodies, like trauma can be passed down from generation. How do you deal with that? I know performance is something that you're looking at performance, but how do you deal with it, or how do you address it? Just want to know what your thoughts are on that.
Johan, that's a great question, because when we talk about the body, we do have to address the idea of trauma. But when I do Lady Anandi, it's my own trauma that I have to deal with. So I, in a sense, have control over it, and it's my story to tell. As a performance maker, I am very careful, or I'm hyper conscious about whose story I'm telling, who's getting represented, because I'm a bit uncomfortable with performance making that breaks artists down, and then they, until they arrive at it, because these are not 3-month processes. Healing is a long-term thing. So for me, it's in the act, like I was saying to Shobna, it's in the act when they come together as 10 people. It's a collective healing for that 1 hour, or it's the beginning of accessing the hurt, because I can't claim to solve it, or I can't claim to close the wound, right? Even just acknowledging that it exists is the beginning of it. And what I do believe in, Johan, is a collective intelligence. And that's where I'm interested as a performance maker, not as an independent individual, almost like patriarchal understanding of it. There's a collective intelligence in the reading room that holds emotions, right? That's one aspect of it. And as a performance maker, as an actor, let's say when I made Lady Anandi, I've been asked this, has it been cathartic? Because I was talking about my body in front of 200 people. So the performance making, while I actually perform in front of the audience, is not cathartic anymore for me. But while I was doing the research, while I was writing the script, while I was working with archival material, that was very cathartic. When I found the photograph of my great-grandfather in the red sari, that really did something to my fabric, my personality. And actually what you said, I did Lady Anandi at JNU, which is Jawaharlal Nehru University. And one young student asked me, he's saying, how can performance be an act of archiving? Because after today, we won't remember anything. Shouldn't archives last forever? And that was he was 19 and he's correct in what he's taught in academia, Shobha. In academia, he's thought we need this to be legitimate. And Johan, that to me is also my feminist practice. This thing of history that will last forever, objects that last forever. No, history fades, it diminishes.
Yeah.
It's alive on
And that's exactly the question you are wanting them to think about.
Exactly. It exists on our
upside down.
Yeah, it exists on our breath. And especially works like yours, you're saying ephemeral. I love that word because it's fleeting, right? So what I'm also saying is, and why is the title of Until It Changes? Archives change. Yeah. They are living, breathing creatures. They are not fixed spaces. If they start to become fixed collections or fixed spaces, then I would be very careful. And that's what I mean by little histories. We complicate it. We are suspicious of the archive. Because the minute I put 2 objects together or 10 objects together, they already have meaning. We've already started to, there's a politics of interpretation already at play. Right? And therefore, of course, I want to complicate this notion by putting my body there. Because like the last quote says, my breath fades and flesh fades and diminishes. So, I mean, I don't know if I answered it, but it's not cathartic. It's not cathartic.
But also it makes a link to the queer archive as well, because queer bodies themselves are ephemeral and people look at ephemera as evidence. I mean, there's also some papers that maybe I can share with Shobhana on looking at ephemera, because queer bodies themselves are transient. And because you try to look for evidence for like hard paper or like oral history. So I think this is a really good way of thinking about it at a philosophical level as well.
That's a great word, evidence. I think that evidence, because there is a whole practice in performance making, which is body as evidence. And that's what I'm trying to say. When you make the invisible body visible, there's already the claiming of that archival space. There's already a claiming of that history in the utterance of my body. So a lot of people, when I made Lady Anandi, said, why are you standing in front of the photograph? Please move. Let us see the archival image. So I was like, no, it's me. I'm there. Yeah. I'm the living, breathing person that interprets the archive for you, right?
Yeah. But also, like when we talk about like queer bodies being invisible, there's also spaces within the queer community where they want to make themselves visible. And so maybe that's also another space. Like when you make statements like this, we're talking about the general
mainstream way of
mainstream way of looking at it.
Yeah. True, very true.
I have a question.
So Memish has a question, and then Kamal, we can come to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi Anuja. I just wanted to remind you about your experience working with the objects.
Yeah.
And the narrative building.
Yeah. So Memish, I'll share the video. So I worked with these Darul Shifa kids. I showed you the video of Hyderabad, those kids. So I worked with them again now from July to October. And because of the pandemic, they couldn't leave the house. So we were working with a story on telegraphy, history of telegraphy in India. It was a short story for children, and the telegraph doesn't make any sense to them, right? So what we started doing is we started looking at things that were in their house. So a bookshelf. And then I started to ask them to draw maps. So if they were sitting on a table, what was, hi. I'm saying hi to Shobhana's son, our daughter. So hi. So they started drawing maps of how to reach the bookshelf. Or this girl had a very modest background and her personal space was under the bed because her parents are tailors, and she showed us the box. So what was the journey from where they were to the objects that they could claim for themselves? That was their treasure. So they walked us through their homes. So we saw things like shiny curtains, and the girls stopped. So I said, become a tour guide in your own house to make it very simple. So how did you relook at everyday objects? So there were curtains, there were almaris, there were bookshelves, there were boxes. One girl went to her terrace and she showed me how she sees the birds every morning. One girl showed me a plant in the house, a rose plant. Somebody showed a giant grandfather clock. So what we started to do is we started to create them as monuments in their house. So yahan se to go to my door, what is the story? And they drew a map and they showed me the map. And so we presented it, and of course I do this documentary style, so there's no character. So somebody like Shireen will come as Shireen and say, my father's a tailor, this is his tailoring table, this is my box. And first she drew an imaginary map, and then we went on a physical journey. And the idea was about distance. The second thing we did is we used the objects in their house to create farthest space. So one girl wanted to see Qutub Minar. She's never been to Delhi. I don't know when she will get to go to the Qutub Minar. So she just brought all the books and she said 500 kilometers, 1000 kilometers, 1500 kilometers. And she says in Hindi, "Pahunch gayi main Qutub Minar." You know, to create a sense of how far things are. The other boy took a football. He wants to go to Iran, the boy who sang the rap. Now he has a small veranda. Now how do you do markers using a football? Using again like bed sheets. So it's like very childlike way of making space. So we use objects to create space, to create distance, and to create the notion of travel. Because they are not traveling just now, right? So it was just playing, you know, Mehwish. I'll send you the video. It's one of my favorite. It's my favorite show actually, which I didn't talk about. But it's a 20-minute. It's a 30-minute piece.
All right, Kamal, your question or thought?
I just had a question when doing like personal work, and so I also teach a class on like reinterpreting personal archives in the US, and so I think my students also, they go through to more artistic places with their archive, and just with my own stuff, I've been finding like recently like another cousin who's really invested in the archive and has a totally different narrative. Like, do you ever find with family members when you're like reinterpreting a great-great-grandfather or something like that, that you're like, that's not the truth? Like, how do you articulate yourself in your whole like recreation or reinterpretation?
That's great. That's the practical question actually, because nobody cared about my great-grandfather until I started looking for things on him, right? Till I didn't ask who he was, are there photographs to the family? Nobody cared. But the minute I asked, are there any photographs? People were like, why do you want the photographs? What do you want to do with the photographs, right? They were like, how much money are you going to make with the photographs? So because I was interested, people became insecure about it, right? And then when I found the 20 photographs, they were not with my grandfather, but with my grandfather's brother, right? So then, and he's dead, so his wife said, I'm not giving you the photographs. Even though they were gathering dust, okay, Kamal, I mean, I was so upset with what was happening to the material photographs. They were gathering fungus and they were crumbling. So she said, no, you take it, scan it and bring it back. So I took them, I scanned them, and now they live through my project, but I don't know what's happened to her go down or her loft, right? So there is always attention. And then somebody said, you know, your great-grandfather was not gay, right? And I said, yeah, of course. I'm not saying that he was gay at all, because I talk so much about him being a woman and you know, just, I mean, he played women characters, for God's sake. There is a queer angle already. So I listen to it, but I do what I want at the end of it. And if they want to tell that story, then please, by all means. He's not just my great-grandfather. He's everybody's in the family. But do take that effort then to research, to tell that story. If you disagree with my story, that's fine. I mean, of course. But do go and claim it, or do go and tell it. But you know, I was lucky. Nobody got into that kind of fight because they saw that I also framed him with a gentleness. And I also framed him in a way that I was putting him back in Marathi theatre history, because he's been left out of theatre history. So there was also a larger picture, Kamal, that what am I doing? I'm not just taking anything away from the family. If at all the family got more attention, perhaps. And most of my family works in banks. I don't think they care. Except this aunt who suddenly thought I was going to sell the pictures, and I never sold them. I mean, I haven't sold anything. These are tricky things to negotiate because I didn't want to alienate my family. I haven't alienated. I invited them to the first show, and they also saw what the larger public, how they were responding. So I think they saw the impetus with which I was doing it. But sure, if anybody wants to tell the story and take the trouble, do let them do it. It shouldn't be competing at all. It's not competing. But you are also entitled to express your interpretation of your family archive, right? These are tricky things, but they have to be managed. And I always say, okay, please take. And one of my cousins started, but she lost steam halfway. She lost the endurance because it's not easy. You want to retell the story, but you have to do it properly. Like Lady Anandi is a properly researched piece. I worked for 2.5 years before I made the performance without any money. So these are not frivolous things. These are lifelong journeys. So if they want to put in that time, good for them.
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I'm glad.
I mean, if I was to add to this, I mean, every step of archiving, we have faced this. So even when it comes to just preserving, which is what we spoke about, let's say, for the first half of the program, that you want to collect, record, catalog, and preserve the material. Even there, we have seen this, that, while it's lying in the drawers, you won't raise questions about the standards of preservation. The moment you move it into an archive, the moment you say, I'm cataloging it, they'll be like, oh, but why are you listing it like this? Oh, but why are you preserving it like this? So what's interesting is the moment there is an act of preserving and engaging, and then comes the storytelling or narrative building, there's always this questioning that follows. And I think that itself validates why we do what we do. Sort of.
That's a great point, Ishita. Yeah, even with cat, yeah, it's true. We're easy to question. Yeah, it's easy to question, but it's very difficult to actually do something. That's what I'm saying.
It almost feels like we're bringing it to life. That's how I
That's
feel.
right.
Because
It's
until
breathing.
then it's lying dormant. It's almost like dead. I mean, nobody would know if it vanished.
Yeah, very
It's
true.
only because we're bringing it to life now people want to engage with it. Whoever.
And that's what I'm saying. The minute there's an utterance, it becomes an object that gains value. The utterance of it. Yeah.
And so at that point itself, the job seems done. So at least if you reactivated it, you brought it to life, resurrected it, whichever way.
Yeah.
Right. Anyone else? Any questions?
I have a question.
Sorry,
Yes.
who's that?
Priyanjali.
So when you start working on an archive, you have so many stories coming in your head. How do you streamline in deciding that this is the story I want to say? Because when you're doing that, you get to know so many other things about their childhood, about other people they've met, professionally how they were, all the family together, and all of that. So how do you, or how did you come to the place, or is it because you were already interested in body and women and all of this, or how did you decide that this is the story I want to say?
No, Priyanjana. I mean, I still ask myself, is this the story I wanted to tell?
Yes, I mean,
so this is just to make it simpler and more practical, your form will determine it. Like if I write a research paper, then the story I tell from the archival collection is quite different. And the manner I tell it is different. But because I was making a performance, I had to be very clear on what I wanted to tell. And I'll tell you what I did. I take a research article, let's say, or I take a photograph and I perform with it. So I would invite actors or I would invite writers and say, now write a fictional story around it. Or I would ask children to interpret photographs. So I start the process of activating an archival object because I'm a performance maker, right? But if I write, and I have written on archives, if I'm writing something, then it's a much more reflective process. So then I say, okay, I want to talk about archives as misbehaving. So then I will follow that thought. So what I'm saying is that your form will determine what the archive tells. And sometimes it's many stories. Sometimes it's a single story. And sometimes in telling of my story through performance, I want to change the aspect. Like I like the multi-layeredness of any kind of storytelling. Like we can't say this is only about gender. Lady Anandi is about gender, but it's also about history. Like Arish is doing work on band artwork. One of my great grandfather's plays was band. So there's another history of the British in India. So it starts to get layers, and that's also what makes an archive or a performance interesting, because then it's open to interpretation, and then different audiences take to it differently. So what I'm saying is, if we create Venn diagrams, so we say, okay, this is about gender, but it's also about plays that were banned. It's also about the colonial history in India. And it's also about the history of photography. Lady Anandi is very much about the history of photography. So then it starts to form different circles. But my core circle I started with was gender, and then I built around that. But that is something that your interest has to tell you. your own, what you have to be like, okay, what are the stories that I'm not hearing? Or what is it that I want to put out as Priyanjali that is unique to me in the way you look at the archive, right? And then you build from it, because as an archivist, you cannot help interpretation. If somebody like me comes, she might tell a totally different story, and that's the exciting part. So the form will determine it, and it will have meta sort of narratives that exist.
Right. Thank you. That was very helpful.
Saman, you have a question, Saman? Ishita, you scare them. She says, hi, Ishita, if time permits, I have a question too. Yes, of course, Saman.
Just so that these other things that you want to present.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? I think,
yes, Saman, I can hear you. Yeah.
So I think you've partly answered the question in the discussion in the previous questions. So I was very intrigued with the way you have made the archives more powerful. So you are working with the agency which archives have and putting your bodily agency and sort of bridging the gap. So I think ensuring that your performances, when you're layering the performances on the material or the archives you're working with, does not hinder the context in which they are placed in, or you do not really working with the context, or you just remove it and placing it and putting your curatorial sort of agency on them. So
no, I very much work within the context, but I question it. For example, National Center of Biological Sciences is a beautiful archive in Bangalore, right? It's a proper institutional archive. I don't know if you're aware of it. It's a very good space. It's an archive of science, right? So it is it houses NCBS, which is a government body, and the archive is archives at NCBS. They invited me to work with the archival collection. Okay. Now, when a science archive invites an artist like me, they know what they're getting into, correct? So I go into the archive, I spent a week, and I start looking at their cataloging, right? And the archive is about a man called Obaid Siddiqui, whose area of interest was the fruit fly or Drosophila, and the entire archive is sort of dedicated to him, to begin. Now, I go through the folder, and he's the man of science, correct? I go through the archival folder, and I look at the folder called Ephemera. There is a folder called Ephemera, okay? And then I click on it. And what's in the folder? There are bills to the hotels he went to. What did he eat? What did Obaid Siddiqui eat when he went to Bombay for a meeting? Obaid Siddiqui was very fond of music. So that because he's a scientist, he's put music lists. So I looked at his music list. Now on New Year's, people like other scientists like Homi Bhabha sent him greeting cards. Happy New Year, Homi Bhabha. Homi Bhabha is India's best known scientist. If I'm going to find a greeting card that is signed by Homi Bhabha, I think it's important. So what I did is I worked with a folder called Ephemera that broke down the sort of institutional nature of Obaid Siddiqui. So we looked at what he ate, what he listened to, who were his friends. So we humanized the man, right? So we broke down the scientist as somebody who loved chow mein. Now, and I presented it in NCBS, and people laughed because they know he's a scientist of the fruit fly, but they don't know that he likes chow mein, right? So I worked within the context, but I looked at something that nobody else was interested in, humanizing the man. So I worked within the context, but I changed it a bit. And that's what I'm saying. Every intervention is political. So it was political, but my politics is very playful. I'm very cheeky. So it wasn't that Obaid Siddiqui is a bad person, because he's not. I don't even know him as a person. But I was like, when he was going to Bombay, what was he doing? He was, and then the music list. He was a great Hindustani music listener. And so I put out new information about the man that already exists in the archive, but because it's a science archive, they never thought to look. They never thought to look at the folder that's at Ephemera. So this way, they got to know their leader better. But I also humanized the leader, saying, hey man, of course he was a great scientist, but he was a person. So I like to demystify, but of course within the context. And now they call me back all the time, and they paid me my money. So clearly I didn't upset them too much. So relooking, Sanam, you have to relook, like refocusing, reframing. is my feminist practice. And I work, all my work is rooted in archives. I have to say that.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone else?
Last question.
My question goes back to what you're saying, because you've made archives very messy now in my head, which is, I know, intentional by you. I want to know about the difference between creating an archive versus using an archive or working with archives. Is there a dichotomy? Is there a gray area? Because, I mean, the traditional understanding of archives is that there are the archivists who create archives. I mean, obviously we are moving beyond that, and there's the historian scholar who has the freedom to interpret that. So are you using performance to interpret what's in the archive? How do we grapple? I mean, I know there isn't a clear answer.
That's a great question, because you know, Johan, a good archivist, and Venkat, who runs the NCBS archive, is a good archivist. A good archivist will allow for both, right? And now I look at Venkat as the artist, because I'm also very interested in the archivist as the artist. The archivist is the curator, and as like Venkat said at a symposium I curated, that all archives have stories in the middle of them, right? And there's Amitesh Grover, who's a very well-known performance artist, said there is an archive inside every performance. There's an archive in every story, let's say. Every archive has a story. There's a story in every archive, and I'm saying every story changes. And that's why it's a response to a larger idea. So I'm saying, whether you're an archivist or whether you're an artist, you have to be open to that story changing. So when I worked with the NCBS archive, let's say that I was telling Sanam, if somebody came and took the same material I worked with and did an entirely new thing, that would be exciting. But what I created first was an artistic intervention. Then, as sort of an archivist, I reframed it. I was like, look, we can look at Obaid Siddiqui and this ephemera folder. And then if they take that folder and do something else with it, it's interpreted. So they looked at my subcategory and made it something else. So I'm suggesting a rather a moving sort of idea of that we change roles quite quickly, right? And I forgot to say that for the NCBS archive, I use a poem as a map. I use a poetry. I use a poem to enter the archive. Now, if somebody else wants to use a speech that our Prime Minister made to enter the archive, that's fine too, and looks at my folder and then dismantles me, because I think that's how archives remain lively. That's how they remain sexy. The minute we start to fix meanings, either as artists or historians or as archivists, I think there's a danger there. Okay, should we move to our exercise? Is everyone?
So I was basically, sorry, I was speaking, but I was on mute, so I didn't realize. Arish has one last point. Do you want to just discuss that and then move on?
Yeah, okay. Can you please expand upon your project futures here as if... So Arish, is your question that how do we archive the present, or what is it? How do I talk about the future? What is it? I can't hear you. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry, my bad. In fact, like, because when you shared your practice and because I've been seeing like all those videos and links you have shared, and by looking at it, it means that it gives an archivist, if you just like running an archival practice, then interdisciplinary storytelling practices might indulge, right? And because when we talk about speculative history, visiting the history as a historical event, and then what would be my part? In fact, like, yeah, okay, that's absolutely fine. Of course, I would be cataloging, and I would be, in fact, scanning documents, and I would just like, like, in fact, like, make them digital, available, kind of like content online. But would it be like, as your practice evolves, like, would it be good enough, in fact, like, if I add some kind of perspective, today's perspective,
of course,
as a kind of like a digital imaging technique used, and reenactment, literally a reenactment of visual reenactment, and then puts some kind of like perspective.
So I'm sorry, I'm struggling to understand the question. Are you saying reenactment of the archive is okay, or I'm not?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, reenactment of the archive, I mean, that's a dangerous thing to say yes or no to. It's a very dangerous thing for me to say, yes, it's okay to reenact it. And it's also very dangerous to say, no, you should not. Because Arish, because archive is what goes into, like somebody was saying earlier, telling the historical narrative, right?
Yes.
So, and I don't deny the archive as a place where evidence is gathered. But I would introduce this word that I like to think about, is that can we be suspicious of the archive?
Right.
Can I start with a certain questioning of it? Okay. And that to me is a desirable starting point. Say, okay, why am I taking this archive at face value? Right? Because we are very suspicious of personal archives. We're like, who told you he's really your great grandfather? They were like, why should we listen to your story? What is the big deal? Correct. But the minute there's an institutional archive, we are trusting of it, right? We trust institutional archives. So my question is, can we be suspicious? Can we do a little bit of digging? And like Ishita was saying earlier, what is the style of cataloging? What object is placed next to what object? That creates meaning. So I would not say a reenactment is desirable or undesirable. I'm just saying, can we can we question it a bit when we enter something? Because in India, the history of reenactment is quite dangerous. I mean, I don't want to get very political, but it's dangerous. So we have to be very careful. So I would look at reframing something, being slightly suspicious. Or even forget suspicion is a bad word. Can I question something? To begin with the place of asking, rather than taking as given, rather than taking that this is the authoritative history.
Yeah. So being, that's I got it. Yeah.
In a simple way, but
skepticism must
be a healthy skepticism. Yes.
Yeah, a healthy.
Yeah. Not a distrust or a mistrust, but just being like, okay, as good researchers do, I'm going to question my hypothesis. That's all. So question, yeah. Okay. Should we get our hands dirty? Should we all jump in as now storytellers of your own lives? This is the most exciting.
I was just adding, one point was the idea of reenactment. It seems like it's not only a problem now in India. Yeah. Interestingly, we always thought it is the global south or a certain section of the geography. But looking at the global politics, I think the issue and the problems of reenactment of history is also affecting the first world countries. And it's a very serious question.
Like America. Yeah, and Johan is asking, but questioning can be dangerous too in the political context.
Of course.
Asking good questions, I think. I mean, questioning is, Johan, that we have to meet over beer to discuss. We have to fight about it. No, I'm joking. But yeah, it's a good question. But let's park that for now. And should we go into making, in the act of utterance, should we utter our truths and then see what happens when we start to tell our own stories? Yeah?
Yes, sounds good.
Okay, so do they know the exercise or shall I explain it to them, Ishita?
No, you will have to explain it. So we have read the schedule, but I think you will still have to explain it.
Okay, so the first, when we are presenting, I would really like you guys to put on your videos. It would really help. But to start off with, it's a really, really simple exercise because we are working with, and Ishita's brief to me was talk about narrative and storytelling. Just to, I don't know how many people are comfortable or uncomfortable, but this is a safe space and let's trust each other with that. You know each other as a group. Oh, Tana, that's such a nice angle. I feel like you're under the bed. That's so beautiful.
No, I'm so sorry. No, I'm actually in my kitchen and I'm like cooking and in this together and
lovely.
So I just put my put laptop on my matka and I'm talking to you. So yeah, I'm like doing a few things together.
maybe there are those objects already. Our kitchen objects are a part of our performance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exercise is really simple. It is called How Would I Like to Be Remembered? Okay, and this is a personal exercise. You people are archival objects. Your life is full of stories. So now the scenario is you are dead. Okay, maybe you died at 80, maybe you died at 90. I don't know when you died. And somebody who's very close to you, either your child or your grandchild or your best friend or your lover or your dog, is at your memorial service. And they are going to tell us about the life that Sanam led or Rupal led or Arish led or Rishita led. They will tell us about our lives. So now why am I doing this exercise? I want to know things about you, and I want it to be told in the third person. Like Anuja was a great person. She played with, whatever we want to say. Or she was a loser, right? But so what we are doing, Arish, is we are projecting into the future. Let's say all of us are, I don't know, we're projecting what the next 40 years of our lives might be like from where we are today. And the third person is looking back on our lives. And that's it. I want you to write it. If you already have not written it, we can take 10 minutes. Normally, it's very good to write it quickly, not to overthink it. And then I want each of you to read it out to all of us. So the exercise is called How Would I Like to Be Remembered? So you have to say, hello, thank you for coming. I'm Anuja's dog. My name is Ella Kuti. And then you tell the story. Who was she? Who was he? What did they do? What did they didn't do? Are there any regrets? How do you want the story of your life? Because we want to tell story of objects. We want to tell story of photographs. But we have to start with telling our stories. Because we know this subject the best. Right? So, yeah.
Sorry, Anuja, just a question.
Yes.
So can the third person be should it be necessarily a single person, or can it be from the point of view of multiple people?
No, keep it a single person. The telling will just to make it simpler.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And again, it could be any context, but it's like you're saying, thank you for coming this evening. Today we met in the jungle because Anuja really liked the wilderness. And here's a glass of beer or whatever, So create the context, frame yourselves, frame your story. Yeah?
Okay.
So let's take 10 minutes to write it.
Sure.
Okay. So before we break for lunch, just some ideas and thoughts on doing this exercise, and why am I placing this in an archival context and in a storytelling context? I think it's vital, but I want to hear your just process of writing it and hearing each other and talking about this archive that we think we know.
Should we respond now?
If I could start, the most immediate observation was about how some of us spoke in abstraction or in interpretation, whereas some of us kept it very real and lived and very direct. I thought that those larger two emerging styles of even writing or reading stories that we have read, both the sort of came out.
So, hi. I think I'll go next. It was, I think, generally a very overwhelming experience for me to just even think about myself and write. I mean, expression by itself was, like you said, it didn't come easily. It took a while for me to actually decipher who I am in the first place, And I realized how important it is for me to contextualize it if I'm to look outside. So, I have to understand what I am, look within first. And that is so important when I'm putting myself in, when I'm even looking at somebody else and somebody else's papers and somebody else's work. So very interesting exercise. And, there was so much more that I could have written. But, I also know what I am into, my immediate context and my surroundings and, the limits also that I have within which I need to function. So that tells me that, I cannot even be over ambitious when I'm looking at even a larger project. So when I'm looking at archives and I'm dealing with a lack of papers, I know that I have to put priorities in place, like the way I prioritize some things about my own self. So it's a very interesting exercise to also see what my scope is.
Hi, can I say
Sorry,
something?
Tana, that's nice. Sorry, just want to comment. Tana, that's
Yeah.
nicely put because I think the scope idea and the
Yeah.
context setting idea is actually a real thing to work with.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
And
yeah.
you know, it makes me also understand what is real and what isn't. You know, what is actually my scope. I should just start doing. You know, and how do I kind of then narrow it down? Very interesting exercise. Thanks.
Yeah, Rupal. Sorry, I just wanted to complete
Yeah.
that thought.
So, yeah, no, sorry. So, yeah, like, one of the things is that whether it was an inanimate object speaking about the person or a third person speaking, what came out strongly is how emotional one can get when talking about a person or oneself. The other thing I initially found difficult was the moment I started writing about myself as a third person, because I was writing it and not that person. Um, one can get colored. I mean, it's like what I believe I am against what a third person sees me as. It's like, how you say that how I believe I look and how I actually look. It's that kind of thing. So I found that a bit difficult because then when you are writing um, as a third person, but it's about it tends to get colored sometimes. As far as the family archive goes that I'm working on, I realized through this exercise that the danger of that happening can also be the case so in my family archive, where you're talking about, say, certain people in the family and you have a better rapport with one person against the other, then that should not come in the way when working on the archive because it's so personal any which ways, right? It's a family archive. So uh, that's the immediate thing that struck me while doing this exercise, these two things, that especially in the case of my family archive. Like anyone doing a family archive against an institutional or otherwise.
So are you saying, Rupal, then that you would stop yourself from taking a certain perspective about characters or photographs or objects in your family? Is that what you just imply? Have I?
Not
What?
stop,
So
but
what would it
one
mean?
has to
Yeah.
be very conscious
Hmm.
about what you write or quote or what you represent that
Hmm.
person as, because in the case of family, then your own comfort level or rapport with that person should not seep in through.
Okay. And may I ask why? Because
I
because
mean,
so are we
don't you think
saying
that would be unfair to that person?
right? So you're saying you want to be fair and unprejudiced. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Is that entirely possible?
Well, no.
Yeah. So I love the idea that this should not come into no prejudice should come into it because
Yeah.
I'm such a great human being. I'm completely unprejudiced, right? I will be fair. Of course, the attempt to fairness, the attempt to equality is a really critical one. But what you're
Right.
saying is even more important. The minute you understand the bias, whatever that bias as an archivist might be,
Right.
acknowledging it is a good place to begin. After that, what happens? It becomes more complex. And I'm not claiming to answer that. That's for you to decide. But I think that acknowledgement of the bias is perhaps a good point, good place to start. Yeah, thank you.
Right. Okay.
Yes, come.
I found that like when I first started writing, I just went to like childhood memory, nostalgia, and it was very enjoyable. And then it was like I think maybe like the seventh minute, I was like, oh no, we have only 3 more minutes and I have to sum up my whole life. And then I felt like this like feeling of like posterity. I'm like, oh no, now I have to get real serious. Like, who was I during all these? So I feel like that's kind of also maybe the process that I might go through in terms of like going through the archive, or others might, where it's like you're in this playful mode and enjoying it, but then you feel that heaviness of needing to represent like the all of it, or that certain things have to be in there. So I found myself going into that zone towards the end of writing and feeling like, oh, I'm missing all this stuff. But when I was in that enjoyable state of writing about that nostalgic memory and going into the past, it was much more like freer. So it was interesting, both of those, fighting between both of those.
Kamal, that's a great observation, because I'm also hearing that one is making choices, and that's also addressing a little bit of the Priyanjali's question earlier. Like at constant places, I heard that people were making choices of style, people were making choices of what part of the story do you want to tell, because we can't tell our stories in 3 minutes. We can't archive the world in, even if it's a 2,000 square foot archive, whatever it is. We are making choices. And what I like is becoming apparent is our process of making that choice. Like Rupal said, the process of the prejudice, the process of the bias. That's a good starting point, because the archive of the world is not possible. It's not even desirable. Can everything be archived? No. Do I want an archive of everything? Possibly not. Are archive unbiased spaces? Certainly not. So I like this process of choice. And then there's the second thing you said, which we don't think about as archivists, is the question of rhythm. As a performance maker, as a musician, as a dancer, as a painter, as a photographer, I think of rhythm of images. I think of rhythm of my show. I think of a rhythm of a story. But just now what you were saying, you thought of the child, when you were talking about your childhood, it was playful. And then some heavy things started to come. So the rhythm changed. Like Rana's telling had a rhythm to it, had a melancholy, even Avantika's rhythm. So we decided the rhythms of our storytelling. So when I enter an archival space, whether it's a digital archive or a personal archive or an institutional physical archive, I'm confronted with the rhythm. I'm confronted with the rhythm of the object. Is it a red colored object? Is the object placed in a lots of white cabinets that soothe me, calm me? Am I looking at glass? So already the material, the stories have rhythms. So if I were to look at a physical archive, I'm looking at rhythm in the space. So I like what you said, that the beginning was playful, you were enjoying it, it was freeing, and then you were coming to the heavy self. Good rhythms create engaging archives, create engaging stories, rather than a monotonous rhythm. By monotonous, I mean a singular rhythm. So something to think of. As a performance maker, I'm always thinking of rhythm. As storytellers, we must think of it. An archive is certainly. And that might make the archive a bit sexy. When I'm confronted with nice white walls, beautiful objects, then suddenly there's something else in the rhythm of the space, in the way I've curated it, in the way I've cataloged it. And which is what I mean, that they're active, alive spaces. So thank you for that. This thing of the playfulness and the heaviness, it's about the rhythm. Yeah. Anybody else before we break for lunch? Just a sense of, yes, Dipti. That was so beautiful. Thank you, Dipti.
Who's next? Is anybody going next, or am I?
You can go next.
Sorry. Thanks, Mavish.
So I think Anuja's got disconnected. Let's just give it a second for her to connect back. In the meanwhile, I think there are quite a few of you who wanted to say something. Priyanjali had also unmuted, and Johan also. Should we just put in names in the chat so we know? And Mavish, yes. And we could just put in the names in the chat. Somebody, Deepthi also.
Yeah. Sorry, I got locked out. And I was saying to Deepthi, it's nice that she left it incomplete. So yeah. And then I got locked out, which is great.
So what I noticed in the context of this exercise is that every story can move us if it's curated well or has enough ownership in it. Yeah, so that's something that I took from the exercise.
And as archivists, I think we are storytellers. I mean, we are making choices. We are creating a language. We are creating emotion. We are creating rhythms. I feel like it would be a bit short-sighted to think that, no, we're just cataloging, we're putting things in sheets, we're cleaning up objects. I disagree there. I think it's a much bigger intervention. And like you're saying, the one that is capable of creating an emotion plus an intellectual stimulation as well. It's not just a service to something. It's not just a service to history, I think. It might be a bit more than that, yeah.
The comment at the beginning of the exercise said it might be easier because you think you know yourself best. And this is a good example to say that while creating archives, we are trying to get closer and closer to the object, but there will never be this perfect truth. So I think the idea of curating and how you present yourself or how you want to be presented, because that's the question. How do you want to be remembered? And there's so much subjectivity in that. And also, since it's kind of a eulogy, you think of the audience, like who is there present, and the kind of responsibility that you have, that maybe there are parts of the archive that you know, but you don't want to bring up at this particular thing because you have a responsibility towards the family or towards the friends. And also harkening back to Kamal about the rhythm you brought, because sometimes there are parts, if you think chronologically from childhood to adulthood to old age, sometimes you can't think because there could be silences, there could be gaps. So how can you think in more creative ways rather than just think of like the chronology? And the archive is so complex and so messy in a sense that sometimes you have to think out of this chronology of the life cycle.
Johan, I think it's really vital what you're saying, that a lot of archives and also museums fall into this chronology business. And like you're saying, there are gaps, and sometimes there is, like I was saying earlier, there are Venn diagrams in response to Priyanjali's question. It might be nice to just make apparent what's overlapping rather than what's missing. So rather than focus on what's invisible, maybe it's nice to focus on where there is a coming together, and that coming together may not be linear. And I like this idea very much, that this allows for a break from chronology. Yeah.
Actually, I would like
I
to
just
come in.
wanted.
Sorry, Marish. Actually,
Sure.
it's
No,
very
go on.
similar to what Johan and you're just talking about. I think this, I'll just continue a little more on this. I felt exactly the same way, and I did have a discussion about this with Ishita when I said about the stories, and I said, it's overlapping. And now with writing this, two things have become very clear, that it is okay to overlap and have my story. And it could be a little biased because I can't do all of it, because for me, I find the experience that my mother's had, and she's alive to get the oral history. So I don't have the other people to get their stories. So it's okay to have my story told with her help as a collaborator. But at the same time, be careful, because I'm presenting this person who's not alive to the whole world, to get more cautious and not just be in this chronology which we've been following, because it's also the collection of data that we were in, that we were not thinking in this process. And I think that this exercise helped us break that and think in between those data and the lines.
Priyanjali, that's excellent, because data collection or research is never chronological. As a researcher, that I know that when I find the story of my great-grandfather, he was old. I never found his birth certificate when I began, right? And I think that's the part about researching or archiving that's interesting. And like you're saying, data, you never find data that this was the beginning of the story. It's always patchy. It's always non-linear. And then I don't know what the obsession with linearity is, even in history. I mean, what is the obsession with beginning, middle, and end, right? And then Lady Anandi goes into completely non-linear storytelling, because I wanted to replicate the research process. The research process, Johan, is messy, as we know. I don't think these are clean, neat things. We try to put them in boxes to make our life easy, to give some structure. But yeah, Priyanjali, I like this idea that the data is, you find things, they're missing. And there was a really problematic archive that Neville Tully was building. It was a film archive. And I asked them, when would the archive open? They said to me, when the archive is complete. And to me, that was the biggest folly I'd ever heard of. I was like, what do you mean? Film poster archive, when it's complete, an archive is always incomplete. By its nature, it's incomplete. It is in the middle of time. The archive never begins at the beginning. It always begins in the middle. Right? What is this folly that the archive will one day be complete? That's a temple. Even temples are not complete. I'm sorry. But archives are never complete, essentially. They are in between.
And they, in fact, form these hyperlinks that I was talking to.
That's right.
About.
Absolutely right. Priyanjali, just one note, like I was interviewing my grandfather before my great-grandfather's project. He was a makeup artist. I used to do oral history interviews. And what I did is I used to ask him to retell the story. I said, when I was 10, you told me the story differently. But what I did is, in my transcription, I used to write that Anuja re-asks him to tell the story. She stops him and interrupts him. So I transcribed my rude behavior and my subjectivity all the time. right? Because I couldn't pretend that I was a detached researcher, because I was not. I had lived with my grandfather my whole life. He had told me these stories, and as an 80-year-old, he was forgetting it. And I used to force him. I was like, no, last time you told it differently, now tell it again. But what I did to make the thing apparent was that I transcribed this. In my brackets, it would be Anuja stops and asks him to retell it. And then I also said as my preface that I'm not a detached researcher. I fought with my grandfather. I have differences with him, right? So working with the mother is not easy. It's not an easy task at all. Yeah, last comments before, Mavish, you had something before we stop for lunch?
There's Avantika and Shobhana also. So if we can just listen to all the points and then maybe comment together. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I'm not going to say that it made everything clear to me, but it sort of did create a lot of furthermore conflicts, because, and I think that's a good thing while doing the archive. What was interesting for me was this, that how people chose, for instance, Johan chose a backpack, and Avantika had a shoe that was narrating the story, or I had a like my cat, and their stories, all these stories were those that are inner stories. Like, these stories are definitely those that the other people do not know about these people. This is what they innately think about themselves, if I'm making that sense, right? But when the eulogies were given by people, like what their daughter would say, what their mother would say, what their sister would say, it would be something that is, the surface that the other people can see, and that only sort of creates a further conflict for me, because each archival material, or even if a person is dead, those inner stories still remain unsaid, because the backpack doesn't talk and the cat doesn't say. That's all. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm the last one. I think.
I wanted to say something. Okay. Okay. Sorry, no, go on, Shobhana.
No, you. Oh, okay. Just sorry, Ishita and Anuja. I've totally used this as a therapeutic session. I think I've probably answered my own question about validity and legitimacy. What I got is basically that I've always lived on the fringe. So I must accept it in this particular project as well, and then extend it to how I hold other women's story within this project. I think that's what I've got out of this, and that is legitimate for me. So I need to sort of just hold it in that. Thank you for guiding me.
Oh, Shobhana, thank you. That's the world holding is such an important thing, because we need to hold space, and archives physically, just if they hold space well, it's already good enough. Like, and I'm saying it for like an emotional, spiritual thing as well. Archives is holding space, and you've just hit the nail on its head by using that word. Yeah. So thank you. Avantika, do you have anything?
Yeah. So I just had this thing going on in my head, that how do I justify this question, when I'm writing, that how would I like to be remembered? And when we talk about something as particular as me, I still have time to sort of articulate and think about it. But when I talk about my grandfather, the question always is, how am I justifying, or am I like pushing myself more to justify this more and more? So for instance, when I started writing about the question you just gave, I just wrote it in a flow, and then I started questioning myself that, oh, is there more that I have to add? And that's when the thinking started to begin. And I'm just worried that in the project, when I work on it in a very creative, flowy way, but then I stop and start, questioning, am I sort of fulfilling other guidelines? Am I, just this confusion around that, am I going or like, am I, is it the right way? I don't know how to put it in right words, but I could just feel this questioning and this confusion even in these 10 minutes while just working on this one question.
Avantika, if I may, I just have one like broader question, okay? So this process is good. Like what I'm saying, it's in the power of utterance. So you wrote it and then you were questioning it. That's always good. I feel like the hindrance happens when we don't even start writing. We doubt ourselves so much that we're all so scared. So I feel like the utterance is good, that you utter it, and then it's really good that you stop and question, is this valid? Is it a good story to tell? All of that. But don't let that come before the utterance, because that means we are frozen. That means we are crippled. And as good neoliberals, we are not doing anything. But what I'm saying is just the act of doing sometimes is freeing. Then, of course, the act of editing is critical. You have to edit. You have to organize. I'm not saying free overflow of emotion at all. My work is quite formal, so there is a structure. But so let the act of utterance happen, even with your grandfather's material. Then you start the process of editing. Okay, editing is good. It's vital. The second thing I would say is whether the interpretation is right. I would ask, and this is for everyone, what is my intention? The intentionality. Why does this archive exist? What is the intention that I have in mind when I make a performance on my great-grandfather? What is the intention for me to bring photographs about Basant? What is my intention? I think the intention question is, if it is to bring into the mainstream stories of queer desire, that's a good intention, that's a clear intention. Now, within that intention, how I answer it, what my map is, what my strategies are, that's your choice. But I think a clear intention. So while you have worked on how to organize material, I think to step back and what is my conceptual intention? The National Center for Biological Sciences, Venkat's intention is, it's a great science archive, but it should be open to seven different stories, is clear. It's a science archive, but artists can intervene and they can use it to make their story. So his intention is quite clear. So what is the intention? So I don't know if you all have done an intention writing exercise. I think you should do it for yourselves. And it can be an abstract idea, but it can also be a very clear one. My intention is to bring notice to a tribal community that was displaced because of the dam. That's my simple intention with this archive. And then, of course, it's open to interpretation and change. But I think intention definition is important. That will define what gets left out, what gets included, how open it is, how closed it is. The intention question is as important as the audience question. Who is my audience is critical. What is the intention? Is it an emotional thing? Of course it is an emotional journey, but it's an intellectual journey. And then the layers will reveal itself. But one intention from which different tributaries start flowing is a critical thing, I think. As archivists who are thinking archivists, not just cleaning and cataloging. Because even in cataloging, what is my intention with this cataloging? Do I want to tell my user that a Chinese notebook is next to a Bangalore-produced notebook? Okay, then what does it say? Or do I want to put all the Chinese notebooks next to each other? What is my intention? The intention question is a hard one to answer.